Okay, welcome back everybody to the next of our talks in our talk series exploring complexity from the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. Today we have our very own Deryc Painter, who will talk about innovation in the Great Acceleration, a topic that we have been working on for about the better part of a year now, together with our colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute. Just a few rules of engagement. This is now not a webinar, but a regular Zoom meeting. So you can raise your hand, use the chat, and if you raise your hand, we will sort of call on you, unmute you, and you can ask your questions at any time, but of course also at the end during the Q&A period. So without further ado, Deryc.
Okay, yeah, thank you all for making time to come listen to my talk. Today we're going to be talking about innovation and the Great Acceleration. This is one of the many projects that I've got going on right now during the pandemic. And so let's dive right in. First, before we get into it, I want to mention my collaborators, of course, Manfred, and then Jeffrey West and Chris Kempis out of the Santa Fe Institute. They have been wonderful partners and helping develop this research project. So a little bit of background before we get started about the Great Acceleration and the Anthropocene, right? So the previous epoch was known as the Holocene, right? And this began at the end of the last glacial period and has gone up until the present. And then more recently, scholars have started to say, well, we've entered a new epoch in which humans are now the primary influence on the entire Earth system. Now, there's a little bit of debate on when exactly the Anthropocene actually begins. There tends to be two camps. The Earth scientists tend to push more towards the dawn of the atomic age, so that you can identify those isotopes in the rock, and the more towards social developments like trade and the spread of certain species, domesticated animals, and so forth across the globe and continents. But for all intents and purposes, we'll say 1950 for this talk, which seems to be a fairly reasonable starting period for this. Now, in 2005, Stefan et al. Gathered a ton of data about how the Earth systems and all these different indicators that you see on the screen here have started to increase since 2000 or since 1950 about. And then it was updated again in 2015, and that's where these graphs show. And you can see they broke these down into two separate categories, right? So we have socioeconomic trends here with things like global gross domestic product, primary energy use, telecommunications, and then Earth system trends, where we look at carbon dioxide, atmospheric concentration, methane, surface temperature, ocean acidification, these sorts of things. So we can kind of break these into two different components. And this was no easy task, right? They spent years gathering this data, and they did a really wonderful job in the supplementary materials of their 2015 paper to make this data available for other scholars to analyze. And that's where this kind of project takes off. So in 2017, Gaffney and Stefan came up with this Anthropocene equation, right? So the change in the Earth system over time is a function of astronomical forces, geophysical, internal dynamics, and the human component. Now, they make sure and note that the human component is actually a subset of the internal dynamics, but they argue that the human component is so influential that it deserves a separate consideration. And in fact, it's so influential that we can effectively set astronomical, geophysical, and internal dynamics to zero, because the premise of the Anthropocene is that humans are now the primary influence. Now they continue with this Anthropocene equation, right? So we take the human component, we can break that down into population, specifically the consumers, or what they refer to as the middle and upper class population, consumption, and by definition, production, and then the technosphere, right? And so the technosphere then is broken down as a function of the energy system, the knowledge in that system, and the political economy in which the technosphere exists. So we already can start to see that people are viewing this as a multi-layered process, a very complex system of interactions. So the first thing we did when we started to think about analyzing, further analyzing Stefan's data, was that if we are in the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration, and the major influence is population, then it makes sense to consider the size of that influence, right? The population itself in respect to those Earth system metrics, right? The socioeconomic and the geophysical forces, right? So here we have the geophysical stuff. Now, to supplement some of Stefan's data, Stefan originally used, so here we have carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. Well, we went and supplemented that with data on carbon dioxide emissions, right? So those are two separate things, right? And so we did that with all of the atmospheric concentrations, nitrous oxide and methane as well. And a couple things to note here. If we look at CO2 emissions, we can see that it's pretty steadily early on in the 50s and 60s. And then we start to see it level off. And we might think, well, we started to implement environmental policies, right? That would slow or reduce CO2 emissions and things like nitrous oxide and methane. Well, we see that change in the CO2 emissions, but when we look at the carbon dioxide concentration and the nitrous oxide concentration, we see that those begin to scale to population at an increasing rate, despite what we see in the change of emissions. And the other thing that I want to make note of is the size of these scaling relationships, right? So much below one, we see a strange thing here with this shrimp aquaculture globally. But overall, we tend to see these scale around one or less than one typically. And so what we've done here, what you're looking at is the scaling relationship by decade, right? So it didn't make sense for us to just run a scaling analysis over the entire 50 or 60 years when things change now at a much more rapid pace, and they change from decade to decade. Decades are arguably arbitrary, but they make for a reasonable demarcation for monitoring this change over time. And now, so this is our geopolitical or our geophysical. And then if we look here at the socioeconomic stuff, here's just a basic scaling equation for your reference. But you'll notice when we look at these socioeconomic scaling relationships, they typically are above one and many times far above one. Now, here we also supplemented some of Stefan's data with knowledge production. So here at the bottom, we've got USPTO patent grants. So the number of patents that are granted in a year by the US Patent Office, and then the number of Web of Science publications in Thomson Reuters Web of Science database. And we use these as kind of a proxy for knowledge production. Now you'll notice these are typically, we've got scaling coefficients 7, 13, I mean, much, much higher than the geophysical components, right? And so this already begins to tell us that those geophysical components operate with physical constraints, right? So if we think about scaling in a network, a completely saturated point-to-point network, you would expect, a maximum scaling somewhere about 2. Well, we already see in these socioeconomic relationships that these have moved past those simple point-to-point interactions. And we start to see these feed-forward loops where these scaling coefficients get much, much larger. So when we take these scaling coefficients and group them, the first thing we see is that they group very, very differently. So if we look at just the geophysical over on the left, we see that the majority of those scaling coefficients are below 1, sublinear, right? A few linear and a small amount in the third and fourth regime, right? So super linear, and then what our group has termed ultra linear, right? So what's bigger than super, ultra. Now, if we look at the socioeconomic scaling coefficients, we see the majority of them scale above 1 or greatly above 1 in that fourth ultra scaling regime. Now, when we think about the Great Acceleration and its role as, kind of a hallmark of the Anthropocene, and, it's reasonable to start to see how this fourth scaling regime, this ultra linear scaling regime, starts to become one of the main points of interest for this analysis, right? Now, to kind of justify that scaling relationship, right, we look at, here on the left, we have a exponential regression, and then on the right, we have that power law regression, right? So what we can do is then look at the relationship between that exponential and power law regression, right? So I apologize for a little bit of math, but it wouldn't be a complexity talk without it. So if we want to justify this scaling equation, right, we assume that y of t is actually y of n and t and a bunch of other stuff that is difficult to quantify. But for what we're doing, we can say y is a product of the metric and time. And the metric is actually a product of time as well. So if we write our exponential regression here and then our scaling equation as thus, then we can do some equivalence and then find that we can then calculate our expected y at year 0, 1950, using our data from our scaling equation, right? And what we find then, when we compare these two, we compare our calculated y of 0 to the reported y of 0. What we see is this distribution of agreements, right? So we have a small tail out here where some are skewed one way, The majority of them are very well agreed. And then we have this large spike here at very little agreement. And so when we look at what these actual metrics are, when at these agreements, we find that a lot of those geophysical ecological metrics tend to scale right around or tend to be pretty good agreement, with a few way out here on the right hand side, right? This would be the shrimp aquaculture and things like that. But for the majority of it, are ultra scaling, so that fourth regime, the ones that scale with coefficients much, much greater than 1, tend to group down here with very little agreement, right? And so what we can start to think about is, in these ultra scaling drivers, there are some hidden variables at play here that we're not necessarily encapsulating with just that straightforward scaling analysis. So the next thing we did to try to get after understanding this phenomenon of the Great Acceleration in context of the Anthropocene and whatnot is running this principal component analysis. So what we find is, when we look at the principal components and we look at the cumulative sum of variance, at about 3, we get about 87, 88% of the total variance. And then if we add a fourth, we get well over 90. And so here on the upper right, we can see those first 3 principal components mapped onto this rotating graph. And we can start to see, as it rotates, that these clusters begin to form, right? And these clusters, while not completely divided between ecological and socioeconomic, tend to be tend to group like that. And then, so principal component analysis can be difficult in that, these components are usually comprised of a lot of different pieces, right? It's not just, this is CO2 emissions, this is gross domestic product. So here in the middle, at the bottom, we can see that you can ignore these, 5 through 13. They don't really tell us much at all. But if we can see the composition of those first 3 or 4 principal components. And now this has got there's a lot to unpack here. But the main takeaway from this is that these components are comprised not solely of those ultralinear scaling, but some are from the geophysical, some are from the socioeconomic. And now there's still a lot of work to be done here, but I wanted to go ahead and show this to you just to give you an idea of how we're going about trying to understand the Great Acceleration and the Anthropocene in the context of that Anthropocene equation. Now, when we look at the ultralinear scaling regime, right, those ones that scale much, much greater than 1, those typically fall into 3 main categories: finance, technology, and knowledge production. Here's 4 graphs just to kind of give a little example. So we've got global foreign direct investment in trillions of US dollars. And we can see how those scale, right? So in the 6s, almost 8, 13. Telecommunications, right? So this is global landline and mobile subscriptions. And we can see this is one of our highest scaling regimes in the 1950s, where it scales at 26. So when we see these kind of data, doing this analysis helps to supplement our traditional historical narrative, right? So in the 50s, there was a big push to bring landline and telephones to rural areas in most of the Western world. And so we see that scaling drastically. But then throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, we don't see a lot of change, right? So we see a much lower scaling coefficient. But then in the 90s and the 2000s, right, with the advent of cell phones and pagers, we start to see that scaling jump up again, right? So that historical narrative has computational signatures in the data, right? And then so here we also have Web of Science and the patent grants. And again, as a supplement to that traditional historical narrative, we can see the patent grants here are very back and forth, right? In the 60s and the 70s. But then in the 1980s, the Bayh-Dole Act comes in, and this makes it much more profitable for businesses and the like to patent technology and make it more profitable. And when that takes place, we can see that scaling coefficient start to really jump up. So in summary, the gist of this is that finance, technology, and knowledge tend to scale in that ultralinear regime, and that ultralinear regime tends to be the kind of hallmark that we look at when we think about the Great Acceleration and by proxy the Anthropocene as a whole. Now, we can also think about second order interactions, right? So it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that these metrics do not exist in a vacuum, right? They feed back and into one another and back onto themselves. So what we can do then is we can look at how the scaling coefficients change throughout the decades, right? So if we take a little sliding window and start to measure those scaling coefficients, we can see how these relate to one another and how they start to group together, right? And one of the things that, there's a lot of data here to unpack, but for the purposes of this talk, I want to just highlight one example in that, so here we have the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then I jumped to the 2000s here because putting 6 of these on a slide was a little much. But I want to make note that foreign direct investment and gross domestic product are always correlated with each other, right? They change in concert in the 50s, 60s, 80s, and 90s. But in the 1970s and in the 2000s, we see those start to change differently, right? So they're no longer correlated. The way those scaling coefficients change are no longer correlated with each other. And if we think back, a lot of people will remember in the 70s, there was a gas crisis and a recession. And it wasn't that long ago in 2008 when the global housing market crashed and all those banks started to go under. But during these times of economic uncertainty, we see foreign direct investment and gross domestic product shift in the way that they're changing together. Now, another thing to note is that in the 1970s, foreign direct investment is the one that breaks away from the group, right? And then in the 2000s, gross domestic product is the one that breaks rank with the other, let's say, drivers. Now, this could be in relation to the kinds of uncertainty that were experienced during these decades, right? So foreign direct investment can be linked to trade, right? And so as economic uncertainty was based in trade, whereas in the 2000s and the housing market crashes, we see gross domestic product break rank and take a large hit as debt begins to mount globally. Now, so I think the big takeaway from this project is that, you know, to understand the great acceleration and the Anthropocene, we need to view it as a complex system, right? Humans are the main influence. I don't think there's much debate in that aspect. But what we find then is when we can use these hockey stick graphs that Stefan puts out in 2015, if we scale those to population, we see these four regimes, right? And this ultralinear scaling regime begins to emerge. And that is highlighted by metrics involved with finance, technology, and knowledge production, which are all components of that Anthropocene equation that Stefan and puts out in 2017, right? When we use a regression comparison to kind of justify our scaling assumptions, we find that those ultralinear scaling metrics have very little agreement with the calculated measures, right? And so this may indicate that there are hidden components of that inherent in that ultralinear scaling regime that we don't fully understand yet. Again, that the principal component analysis indicates that there are these complex interrelationships. And if we think about those correlations between the scaling relationships and how they change over time, we can begin to see influences or correlations between our traditional historical narratives. And at some point down the road, they may be able to develop these kinds of analysis to talk about things like economic bubbles and so forth. Now, there is still a lot of work left to do, right? There is a lot to be parsed out from that principal component analysis. We have all these correlations, right? I showed you just the main ultralinear scaling relationships, but we have those correlations between the scaling relationships for all those metrics. And there's a lot to parse out there, but that won't get us all the way to that Anthropocene equation, right? So we're going to have to think about what are some new data sets that might be needed going forward, especially when we think about things like the political economy and the energy in the system of the technosphere and these sorts of things. So and then lastly, using these kinds of computational techniques create a very strong supplementary analysis to our traditional historical narrative, right? So when we think about the environmental policies that were enacted in the 80s and the 90s, right? We can see those reflected in our scaling analysis when we compare those metrics to population, right? Which we would not have seen, right? We don't see any of that as evidenced when we just map those metrics in time, right? Using the scaling analysis to population allows us to get a better indication of how these things are changing, right? And so we saw that in those environmental policies. We see that in the economic uncertainty of the 70s and 2000s. And so this kinds of analysis are what is needed as we go forward in trying to understand the Great Acceleration, in the sense that the big, I think, unspoken concern, right, is that when we look at those climate scaling graphs, we see that even though our emissions and things have changed, we don't see that reflected in the concentrations in the atmosphere, right? And so the idea is that because these scale exists as an economy of scale and scale below 1, there is a kind of buffer system there in action. And the concern, I think, is that, you know, these buffer systems, you know, you can only push them so far, and there may be hidden tipping points in the future that we don't see or we don't know about. And to kind of create actionable policies in the future, right? Taking a more holistic, complex systems approach to the Great Acceleration is drastically needed. So that's all I have for this project. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we can talk about any of the other projects that I'm involved with.
Okay, well, thanks, Deryc. Are there any questions? I think you should now be able to unmute yourself and just talk. I think that is much more useful than trying to raise a hand and then we have to find you and unmute you. So unmute yourself and ask your question.
So I'll ask something. Thanks for the talk, Deryc. I was interested in this difference that you were saying between sort of sublinear and superlinear, ultralinear cases. I was noticing that in a lot of the ultralinear cases, like these finance and more technological or social aspects, that it's not just that you have sort of consistent ultralinear scaling, but you have much more variance in time in these beta coefficients that you're getting. So to me, that's saying that also, I mean, I think there is a difference between these two types of behavior, but that also in these more social cases, that there are, you know, other important sort of latent variables that we're not measuring, maybe, right? There are social policies, right? The narrative that you put to it was that, well, you know, we had this policy in the 50s, but then the policy changed later on, right? So there are all of these hidden things that are important to the system, but that are not just reflected in, say, the population. So is that how you're thinking of this too?
So yeah, I think you bring up a good point. That's kind of what we were trying to get at when we compared the exponential to the scaling regression, in that there are these latent factors, right? So I think that's where that historical narrative starts to come in, and it may be that that historical narrative becomes that political economy variable in the Anthropocene equation, right? So we, you know, as these policies change, we can see them reflected in the way that these scale to one another, not just in the way that they scale, but the way that they change in concert with one another, right? So when we see that change in GDP and FDI during, you know, these economic uncertainty, it starts to become apparent that, you know, it's not just how they're scaling, but how they're relating to one another in this kind of very complex network of interaction. And the other thing I'll say about that is that, you know, these socioeconomic scaling, these ultralinear scaling, because they're so high, we can also think that these systems have moved past that traditional physical limitation of, you know, theoretical maximum for scaling and interaction networks. Does that answer that?
Yeah, that helps. I mean, I think, yeah, this is a long conversation too, but there's so much interesting stuff that can be done with this data. I think you're just on the cusp of it. Yeah.
Yeah, still a lot of interesting work and exciting stuff that I can't wait to dig into a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Anybody else?
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. Thanks for the interesting talk. I guess, yeah, I have two questions. One's technical and one's sort of more big picture. So I'll ask the technical one first. I think a couple slides forward from here, you showed this sort of histogram where you separated these scaling coefficients based on, yeah, this one here.
Sure.
So I guess I'm a little confused at what you're showing here. So you've labeled this ecological metrics, and did you just like look at the data and say like, okay, these are all ecological metrics, and then these are the ultra scaling drivers, or are you just using this graph to make that division?
So when the calculated from that comparison is divided by the actual reported data, right? So this is the result of that simple division. And then when you go back and you look at each one of these, you know, each one of these has a metric associated, a metric and a decade associated with it. And what we find is the ecological metrics tend to agree very well with that calculated to the reported, right? And the ultra scaling, that the ones with the betas much greater than 1 have a much starker less agreement, so to speak.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering about what the nature of that agreement is, right? So here you're putting calculated over reported. So that means that you're systematically overestimating the scaling from the ultralinear drivers, if I've got that right. But it's a little bit difficult to parse if the agreement is actually better because it's a ratio. So I'm wondering if instead of this ratio, if you had a plot where you like took the difference and divided by the reported, for example, right? Because that would like, it's a little confusing here because the ratio is sort of like creates a weird scaling below 0 versus above 1 versus below 1, or even transforming the x-axis to a log would, like, I think I see what you're saying, but I just wonder if you rescaled this data, if you would see that the ecological metrics are actually like close to 0, sort of well clustered, and then you would have these ultra scaling drivers on either side. And I think that gets to Brian's point where it's like there appears to be a lot of variance in these ultralinear coefficients. But anyways, yeah. So I was kind of confused about that, but I think your explanation makes some sense. My conceptual question was, it's a really interesting result to say that, you know, these geophysical things are scaling sublinearly while our sort of socioeconomic are scaling superlinearly, right? This sort of seems like almost like a miracle if you're worried about the future of the planet, right? Where you're saying like, you know, all these people that say we need 0 growth to have a sustainable planet are actually maybe wrong. Like maybe we don't need 0 growth, but we need like to you know, super flatline these geophysical drivers. And what we see so far suggests that we can make that number sort of arbitrarily small while still having positive growth. And so I guess I'm just curious, like if you have thought about the implications of that, or how you might sort of try to model the relationships here to see if you could sort of drive the geophysical drivers to arbitrarily small, and then see what the remaining sort of growth is and say, actually, you know, for a sustainable planet, our target doesn't need to be 0 GDP growth. It needs to be somewhere in here, something like that. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts there.
Okay, so you know, the geophysical, I think the reason that they scale below 1 is because there are these buffer systems built into the planet Earth, right? And these kind of nutrient cycling stuff. And then the much higher scaling regimes occur in the socioeconomic. I think there's a couple parts to that. This geophysical have these buffer systems that kind of dampen, right, and exist at this kind of a economy of scale almost, and they are limited not only by a buffer system but by the physical, by a physical system as well. Whereas the socioeconomic, right, has moved past that point-to-point interaction and is now something, you know, greater than the sum of its parts, right? And I think, yeah, so the question of a sustainable future, right, is that, you know, if we monitor these kinds of, you know, trends in the geophysical, and we start to see that those betas start to push more towards 1, more towards greater than 1, right? I think then we can start to think about, you know, how are those feedback loops, are they still operating? Have we overloaded them? And these sorts of things. But, you know, it will take, you know, as with most problems with the world, it will take some innovation, right, to kind of deal with these new kinds of problems, I think.
Well, if I can sort of jump in here, Cole, I think that one of the things that we need to sort of further untangle is also the interdependencies of those drivers and population growth. So we scaled them now to population size in order to figure out how those various drivers behave vis-a-vis population size. But they are also enabling the population growth during the period that we see. And that is something that we still have to analyze in more detail, because it will have implications for the question about what to do about the future.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm wondering, just thinking about this now, if there's like a subset of the data that's maybe related to more like extractive economies, right? Like lumber or mining, things that are not decoupled from the physical substrate yet. And if the comparison between those and like these knowledge economy metrics that you guys have is maybe useful in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are evidence in these geophysical scaling that there is innovation and a kind of overcoming of that physical limitation, right? So the shrimp aquaculture is, I originally thought this was a really weird data set, but the more I think about it, you know, not only is it a geophysical, but it's also a technological indicator as well, right? So we've gotten better at producing food, and the more food that we can produce, right, as Manfred was saying, is this kind of enables that population growth, you know, and to kind of you know, not just a one-to-one thing, but a feedback system. And then on the other end, right, so we have the shrimp aquaculture, and we have the marine fish here, where, you know, pretty consistently early on scaling above 3, but then as we start to see that scaling drop off, you know, is that because we're depleting the ocean? Is that because we have new regulations? So there is still some to unpack, but I think that you get to the point that, you know, these data sets are not the end all be all, right? We definitely need, well, I guess, you know, scientists always say that we need more data, new data sets.
Any other question? Well, if not, then let's thank Deryc for this very stimulating presentation. And we hope to have more in-person discussions about all of that soon once we are all back on campus, because there are certain limitations as to what you can do with this kind of format. So thanks again, Deryc, and everybody have a good weekend.
Yeah, thank
See
you all.
again in 2 weeks when we have Brian presenting here.